President Zelenskyy claims that liberating 590 square kilometers of territory this year has forced Russia toward diplomacy. The stakes are clear. If you believe the battlefield dictates politics, then victory means negotiation is imminent. But what if this calculation overlooks a fundamental failure in how states respond to loss? By watching this video, you will discover why territorial gains often fail as leverage against regimes that have already decided on long-term attrition, and understand the hidden logic behind Moscow's refusal to negotiate despite significant setbacks. The narrative circulating from Kyiv suggests a direct causal link between battlefield telemetry and strategic capitulation. The premise is simple: push back hard enough, take back land, and the enemy runs out of will. Zelenskyy points to specific metrics as proof that Russia must now seek peace. Reports confirm Ukrainian forces made significant gains in early 2026, liberating over 400 square kilometers in directions like Oleksandrivka and Huliai alone. These tactical successes did slow the Russian offensive pace from 10.95 square kilometers per day down to just 5.16 square kilometers daily. On paper, this looks like a turning tide that should trigger a diplomatic pivot. However, assuming battlefield metrics automatically translate into political decision-making is a classic input-output failure in complex adaptive systems. Here is the thing about modern warfare: it operates on two distinct layers of reality. The first layer consists of physical facts you can measure with radar and satellite imagery. You gain territory here, they lose supply lines there. The second layer exists entirely within the political minds of decision-makers, where survival instincts override tactical losses. When a state leader faces territorial attrition, their calculus is not about land area in square kilometers. It is about regime survival thresholds. For Vladimir Putin and his inner circle, losing territory represents soft degradation, while internal collapse or forced negotiation without favorable terms represents hard failure. The system has already been reconfigured to absorb the shock of battlefield losses because the cost of capitulation exceeds the cost of continued fighting. Quick resource note: I keep a curated set of Amazon search links in the description for books, gear, and tools relevant to this channel's topics. Some are affiliate links, so I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you. Please consider supporting the channel by using those links if you find something useful. This creates a situation where Russia views territorial attrition not as a trigger for surrender, but as a viable path toward exhausting Western support. They are playing a game of endurance rather than one of conquest. The internal political incentives now favor a protracted war, regardless of how much ground is lost or gained on the front lines. By treating every square kilometer liberated by Ukrainian forces as an input that must force a state change in Moscow, Kyiv may be operating under a strategic blunder. They are assuming their adversary shares the same decision-making architecture they do. In reality, Russia has likely converged on a protracted war attractor long ago. This means no amount of external pressure from battlefield losses can induce them to switch strategies because their internal state variables have already locked in. Consider the concept of strategic bluffing as a distributed denial-of-service attack on an adversary's decision-making latency. When Zelenskyy projects that territorial gains are forcing Russia toward diplomacy, he is attempting to manipulate the opponent's cost-benefit analysis through signal noise rather than operational reality. The goal is not necessarily to change Russian minds immediately, but to induce a premature state transition in their planning stack. By creating uncertainty about whether Moscow can sustain losses indefinitely, Kyiv hopes to force them into a corner where they must negotiate on terms more favorable to Ukraine before Western support wanes entirely. But this assumes the opponent has any flexibility left to move toward that diplomatic endpoint. The complexity of Zelenskyy's own position further complicates the claim that Russia is being forced into diplomacy. Reports indicate Kyiv may be preparing for a frozen conflict scenario where concessions involving 20% of territory are considered necessary to preempt a separate deal between Washington and Moscow. This suggests that even within Ukraine, there is an acknowledgement that forcing total Russian capitulation through battlefield gains alone might not work in the near term. The discrepancy between claimed metrics like 590 square kilometers and conflicting reports about ongoing Russian offensives highlights a critical data integrity issue in political signaling. In this environment, the truth of any specific metric matters less than the signal-to-noise ratio required to manipulate the adversary's perception of their own vulnerability. Treating territorial metrics as a primary key for diplomatic negotiation is an architectural anti-pattern in strategic statecraft. It fails to account for the latency and buffering inherent in internal political incentives, where regime collapse acts as a hard failure condition that outweighs any soft degradation from losing land. The assertion that battlefield gains forced diplomacy represents a single point of failure in Ukraine's current strategic model. It ignores the redundancy of alternative pathways available to Moscow, such as economic attrition or internal consolidation, which allow the system to absorb territorial shocks without triggering a diplomatic exception handler. Russia has demonstrated resilience by shifting its economy toward war production and tightening domestic control, effectively insulating itself from external pressure that relies on speed or scale rather than fundamental regime stability. The primary knowledge gap remains in understanding the specific correlation between battlefield metrics and Kremlin decision-making thresholds. Without direct intelligence on Putin's internal political stability or the precise impact of Western sanctions fatigue, we cannot assume a linear relationship exists. The assertion that territorial losses automatically compel diplomatic engagement remains an unverified strategic assumption rather than an established fact. It is possible Russia calculates that time works in their favor regardless of who holds Oleksandrivka or Huliai at any given moment. They may believe Western support will erode faster than Russian resolve, making a long war the optimal strategy even if it means holding less territory for longer periods. This perspective shifts how we interpret current events from a story of imminent victory to one of grinding attrition where both sides are locked in a struggle of endurance rather than maneuver. The real insight is that forcing diplomacy requires more than just pushing back on maps. It requires changing the internal cost-benefit analysis of the adversary's leadership, which often depends on factors far removed from frontline statistics. Until those internal incentives shift, claims about forced negotiations may serve better as strategic signals to allies and domestic audiences than as indicators of actual Russian policy changes. The war is not ending because land was taken. It will end when one side decides that continuing the fight costs more than accepting a negotiated reality they can survive politically. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I am a one-person team working hard to make each video better than the last. Subscribe if you found value. It is the best way to show support. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. See you in the next video.